I'm really pleased to be here today moderating this panel, and in so many ways I am connecting at so many levels to what some of our presenters have already discussed with us. In particular, you are looking at the 20 years between the first law, before the first study done of legal practice in Saskatchewan, and then 20 years later. My graduation was 1991. And although we have heard today a lot of things that give cause and concern and perhaps even leave people feeling a little depressed and worried about the future of women in practice, I'm proud to say I'm one of the anomalies in that I am 22 years in private practice, practicing with another female business partner who has been in private practice for, I think, in excess of 30 years. And today, our panel is going to be presenting on conflict, emotional well-being, and the practice of law and legal education. Conflict. So, I think without conflict, we don't have growth. Without conflict and stress, there's no perhaps no growth, no change in either ourselves as individuals or in our society. But we also know that prolonged, significant stress and conflict can be destructive. Today's panelists are going to explore the many forms of internal and external conflicts that are faced by lawyers, and discuss how those conflicts impact both us as individuals and ultimately the future of the legal profession. Our first presenter is Lawrence Krieger. Lawrence is actually going to be making his presentation by a pre-recorded audio presentation. He will be available by Skype to answer questions that you may have after. Lawrence is a clinical professor of law at the University of Florida in the US. He's been in that position since 1991. He is perhaps a leading researcher on the well-being correlates of law students and is currently completing one of the largest studies on lawyer well-being that's been done to date. He's the founder of Humanizing Legal Education Movement and also the founding chair of the section on balance in legal education of the American Association of Law Schools. He is one of 26 lawyers featured in the book, What the Best Law Teachers Do. And I do want to I perhaps am cautioning you, and I perhaps am not. There may be what appears to be random acts of crayon on his presentation, but perhaps not. You may be seeing some pointing going on that may distract you, but perhaps not. I can assure you that's just because we have attempted to the very final hour to bring you the most up-to-date electronic presentation possible, and we may or may not have achieved that. Our second presenter is from the faculty at the college here, Professor Michaela Keat. She's been involved in curriculum development at the college in the area of dispute resolution at every level of the college's program, including the design of a first-year program of intensive education in dispute resolution for first-year students, as well as developing advanced courses in negotiation, mediation, and clinical placements in dispute resolution. She was awarded the Provost's College Award for the most outstanding teacher in law. Her focus of research has been on the evaluation of dispute resolution practices and programs and conducted and or partnered in much empirical studies and research. She is the author of numerous journal articles on topics including collaborative law, lawyers' roles inside mediation, and the integration of mediation in the court systems. Our third presenter I'm pleased to present to you is Lynn Jenkins. She has, and she's said, I'm not coming from the same perspective of everybody else. She does not have a legal background. She has worked as a counselor, educator, advocate, consultant, manager, and program director in the violence against women sector for 20 years. However, she has, I think, some unique experience and perspective on the legal profession and lawyers and what it is that we deal with in our day-to-day lives. She has considerable experience and training in the area of trauma as it relates to the design and delivery of therapy programs and services, which includes training professionals, community workers, and volunteers across various sectors and systems that deal with victims of abuse in the course of their work, including social service sectors and the legal system. She is a director of counseling services at the Barbara Scheifler Commemorative Clinic in Toronto, Ontario, where she supervises an experienced team of trauma counselors, transitional and housing support counselors, and intake counselors. She provides the clinical supervision to her counseling department, as well as the clinic's court support worker program. Her most recent efforts also include improving the well-being of professionals by the delivery of an established curriculum to train students in mitigating the effects of vicarious trauma. And last, but certainly not least, because we're leaving you on at least a happy title note, Marilyn Poitras, who is also a member of the faculty here, will be speaking to us on happiness and the law. Marilyn joined the faculty in 2009. Prior to academia, she describes her professional life as a fusion of law, governance, community, and institutional education. Her expertise and passion is around constitutional Aboriginal law with a life study in customary laws. Her legal career began as a native court worker and then moved into the area of constitutional law and publications with the Saskatchewan Department of Justice. She's developed a number of legal education initiatives, including the precursor to the Akiskirak Law School in Nunavut, where she has also been a professor, and as well as the Indigenous Peoples Resource Management Program at the University of Saskatchewan. Her current research that she's going to be speaking to us about today is studying the impact of the practice of law on students and practitioners. So first of all, I'm not going to interrupt the panelists as they present in order. And so you can join me right now in one warm round of welcome for everyone, and we will proceed into Lawrence Krieger's presentation.
So I'd like to thank you all so much for having me to speak, share my ideas with you today. It's really an honor to be asked, and it's awfully nice of you to listen to what I have to say by distance. I'm sorry I can't be here, be there with you, let's say. I am here. But I wanted to think about my well-being work in the broader context of your conference. I know it's about well-being, but it's also about personality, coherence, interpersonal behavior, conflict. So I thought I would try to gear my comments about well-being into the context of coherence and conflict, also competition, harmony, difference, different ways of looking at those issues from primarily the intrapersonal perspective within personality, and to some extent interpersonal as well. And hopefully these will be useful themes for some of the other speakers coming after. So some of you may have read some of my work with Dr. Sheldon. we work from self-determination theory to look at well-being and life satisfaction in lawyers and law students. And one thing I'll mention is we're just finishing an exceptionally large study of lawyers in 4 states down here in the U.S. We have a working sample of about 6,200 lawyers, and I'll be showing you some of those data results toward the end of this talk. I'm going to try to go quickly so we leave a little time for questions too if you have them. So as you can see from self-determination theory, the way I'm thinking about it for this conference, the sources of human thriving or well-being and high performance are actually sources of personal and interpersonal coherence and harmony as well. I think it's a very constructive way to think about it. I'm grateful to have that perspective from preparing this talk. And the converse is also true, that anything that creates intrapersonal or interpersonal conflict is going to be a source of ill-being or lack of well-being for lawyers or law students. So quickly I'll run through the sources of well-being and thriving for people generally, and then later in the talk I'll show you it's very, very true for lawyers, that we're basically just like other people. But as you can see from this slide, there are 3 basic sets of personality dynamics that we look at in self-determination theory that are strong predictors of well-being. The first is our basic human needs. Second is our motivations, or why we choose to do things. And then the third is our values or goals, basically what we choose to do. And in each of these, there are very strong factors that would tend to increase intrapersonal and interpersonal coherence and harmony, and those precise factors are the ones that are the strongest predictors of well-being for all human beings. You can also see here that, call it coincidence if you will, I don't believe in coincidences, but all of these sources of well-being in human life are also sources of professional and ethical behavior, because professional and ethical behavior comes from coherence or integrity, harmony within a person, and also integrity and harmony in groups or between people. So all of this fits together. There we go. So run through quickly the human needs first, sources of thriving and coherence. This first primary need, the autonomy need, it's called in psychology, I also call it authenticity, because as you can see from the definition there in the parentheticals, it's a measure of how much people's behavior expresses their true values, in their own opinion, and their true self. So it's very much about authenticity or genuineness, and basically that's the same thing as integrity, that what I believe inside is what I say outside. What I do outside expresses what I hold dear inside, and so forth. It's all a coherent single unit, integrity. And then the second key need that very much relates to coherence is relatedness to other people. And obviously the connection there with professionalism is the ability to get along well with others. All the problems of incivility and so forth would be the lack of relatedness to others. Then looking at the motivations and values that produce both well-being and largely express coherence within and between people, this internal motivation kind of says it all. It's about autonomy or integrity again, that I'm choosing an action because it's satisfying to me and or because it supports my own values. So again, I'm expressing myself by choice in my work, in my activity. And then the values, the what that we choose to do, these intrinsic values that you see listed here are the values that have been shown to generate well-being. Now let's think about them in the same context of coherence and harmony. You can see this first value, again, is about the self. Self-understanding, self-acceptance, personal improvement. Again, there's that internal harmony. Second, intimacy, very much like the relatedness need. Intimacy, connectedness with other people. And then helping others and building community. It's all about relationships with other people and being in community with other people. So all of this is about both well-being and coherence on the personal and interpersonal level. By contrast, these are the other motivations and values, the ones that, our American dream is all about. External, imposed, introjected from the environment or from others, rather than personal, autonomous, coming from inside. So the kinds of things that we all would like, but it turns out that these are very modest at best predictors of well-being, as you'll see a little later in the talk. And these are sources of competition, difference. And these are sources of competition, difference, and incoherence between people, because many of these things are zero-sum outcomes. We can all be strongly related to other people. We can all feel competent. We can all have perfect integrity if we choose to and work toward it. But we can't all be rich. We can't all be popular. We can't all win in the competitions, just going down this list here. We can't all be in the top 10% in grades and ranks and so forth. And so these extrinsic motivations and values tend to generate incoherence, disharmony, difference, competitive, zero-sum outcomes. All right? Now, there's nothing wrong with these. We can all be happier if everybody liked us and we had lots of money and all those kind of things. So there's nothing wrong with these, but you'll see the comment at the bottom of the slide here. If these are primary in a person's system, if this is why you took your job, for the money, or to please other people, or to impress them and so forth, you're not going to be happy. Okay? All right, the next little piece here is thinking about law school as a source of conflict and incoherence within people and between people. It's very well known now, well, unfortunately very well documented, that law school is a source of negative well-being, depression, anxiety, and so forth for law students. This is a summary of the major work done by Professor Elizabeth Mertz. She's a contracts professor, I believe, at the University of Wisconsin Law School, who's also an anthropologist. She did a linguistic study of 8 law schools, the first semester training, and these are her findings about what happened to law students at all those 8 very diverse law schools. Look at these and consider these in terms of both the sources of well-being, those needs and values, and the tendency to have internal harmony or internal conflict, and harmony or conflict and incoherence between people. Just take a look at her findings. These are exact quotes from her study. So I'll give you a minute to look at this. This is what the result of learning to think like a lawyer is, as far as she could tell. So you can see many of the things, the most critical things that we talked about already, the sources of well-being, the sources of human thriving, the sources of intrapersonal and interpersonal coherence and harmony, are directly undermined by thinking like a lawyer and competing for the win, the zero-sum outcome. The self is threatened, values are threatened, conscience, which is a deep part of our self, is threatened, caring about others is undermined, moral reason is undermined, and ethical judgment, as a result, all undermined by law school. Dr. Sheldon and I have published research showing the effects of this. So now to talk about our current lawyer study, and then I'll leave a few minutes for any questions or comments that you all have. As I mentioned, we had 4 very diverse states down here in the U.S. We had 7,800 respondents from those bar members, of which 6,200 were usable data sets. Here's what we found. Now, there are 2 clusters here. Notice the top cluster on each of these next 2 slides involves those sources of well-being. Here it's the needs for relatedness, autonomy, and competence. And the first 2 we've talked about are deep sources of coherence and harmony within oneself and between people. And then the second cluster of items are the external goals, values, or benefits of life: making money, having less law school loans, making high grades. It's sort of the 3 key stressors, we could say, in law school. We could add law review membership or not to that. That's quite a striking result. And notice in this first column, well-being. This is that measure of thriving. You can see for the needs, the well-being correlations are enormous. 1.0 would be a perfect correlation, like the sun comes up and it gets lighter. Always happens, right? Here, the correlations are in the 2/3 range. These are gigantic. So clearly, these needs are critical for well-being. We've already talked about how critical they are for professional behavior, integrity, being civil, connected with, relating well to other people, and so forth. You can see the large drop-off, the well-being benefits of higher income, 0.19, less than 1/3 of these internal needs. Higher grades, benefit of 0.12, less than 1/5 of those things. And then over in this column, it's the converse check, depression, as an apparent result of these variables. You can see, again, income and loans don't help with depression a whole lot, but some, and the needs are huge factors for avoiding depression. Okay, one more set of results from our study, which I'm writing up right now, trying to finish it and get it into press somewhere. Again, looking at the top cluster here are those internal, this time it's motivations and values instead of needs, and then the same 3 external variables down below. You can see the well-being benefits here, again, extremely high for particularly internal motivation, the first one. Autonomy support, which is next, is a supervisory matter that we won't have time to go into now. If you want to ask about it, you can. And then values, almost a 0.3. All these, again, are very much greater than income, higher grades for well-being. And just to remind you that internal motivation, doing what I love, what I care about, doing what I think is important, that's a coherence factor as well as a powerful well-being factor, probably because it's a coherence factor. Intrinsic values for self-acceptance and understanding, being close to other people, building community. Again, these are very strong, both for professionalism and for well-being. And the ones below would be neutral for professionalism and just modestly helpful for well-being. Okay? So just to summarize, the sources of personal and interpersonal coherence within and between people are sources of well-being and professionalism, ethical, moral behavior, and external motivations and values, the American dream for money, power, fame, beauty, popularity. All those things would be neutral, basically, for ethics and professionalism. Unless a person feels driven to gain them, then they're going to start pushing the edge too far. But they do tend to generate difference, incoherence, competition, and hence undermine well-being if taken to an extreme. Right? So here's my email. I'd be happy to receive notes or comments from you all, and I'll just stop now and we can go on to others or take any questions or comments that you have. Thanks very much.
We actually will be saving all questions and comments for the very end of the panel. So next, if I might ask Michaela to come up.
Thanks, Connie. So I'd like to start with a quote by David White that has been pinned to my office wall for the last 10 years. And this is how it goes. To have a firm persuasion in our work, to feel that what we do is right for ourselves and good for the world at the exact same time, is one of the great triumphs of human existence. So I start with this quote because it refers to the connections among one's inner personal life, professional identity, and day-to-day work. And at a personal level, this quote captures my own journey to find the place where these energies line up. And I want to talk about that journey today. But I also want to talk with you at a professional level about the connections that I see between emotional well-being, changing norms about the lawyer's role, and the appetite for problem-solving and dispute resolution approaches. And here I should be transparent about the fact that I'm a mediator and I'm a teacher of conflict resolution skills and models. So I don't come by the following observations accidentally. Let me begin with the personal. For today's purposes, in today's context, my story starts 2 years into private practice. At that early stage in my career, I had been working hard, as Professor Krieger called, to think like a lawyer, which in my practice meant as a litigator. I had perfected the assertive tone of demand letters. I had perfected the self-righteous content of affidavits, the tough positions that one might take at the outset of a pretrial conference, how to hold my ground. So I could act like a lawyer with opposing counsel, with clients, all in shiny business suits, all 20 years older than me. Professor Krieger mentioned that he began with 3 sets of needs that we have in our professional work. My need for competence was slowly beginning to be met. So was my need for relatedness. So I had meaningful opportunities to connect with clients. This I interpreted in my developing lawyer's psyche as an opportunity to rescue clients. So with professional work that allowed me to feel competent and to relate to people, I felt on my way to a highly rewarding career. And yet, I was starting to feel strained. Listening to Professor Krieger talk, I see that now as some tiny bit of intrapersonal incoherence. Something that I had yet to define wasn't sitting right. So this brings me to one summer day in Saskatoon. I had been asked to handle a 2-day examination for discovery in a motor vehicle accident case that our firm was handling as an SGI farm-out, back in the day when we did a lot of motor vehicle accident files. We hadn't admitted liability, although it was obvious to me that at some point in the progress of the file, we were going to admit liability. My job in the exam was to manage the information given by the defendant driver, who I was meeting for the first time that day. A young man with a ponytail who had been driving a Volkswagen with peace signs that he had carved into wood and inlaid into all of the windows. So I knew he was a risk in terms of the comments that he might make under oath in the exam for discovery, and my job was to contain him as much as I could. After the exam, he and I were walking back to my office at the firm, me managing a politely distant conversation with him. And he started to ask me why I had become a lawyer. And all of a sudden, just as we were crossing 2nd Avenue, he stopped me in the middle of the street. He turned to me and he locked me in his gaze. And he said, "Don't let it change you." And for me, that was a moment of epiphany. He had somehow reached into my carefully constructed frame for lawyering and invited me to step outside it. And just for a moment, I did. And I caught a glimpse, a fleeting glimpse, but a glimpse nevertheless, of a need of mine that had been slowly slipping away. One that Professor Krieger describes as vital. I see that now as the need for authenticity. So over the months that followed, I started to take a more critical look at whether my work was congruent with my values. A better way to put that, I think, is that I started to feel whether my work was congruent with my values. A couple of months later, I found myself, now I realize not by accident, in a mediation training course. And there I found, like many lawyers find when they take such training, to be full of aha moments for me. It gave me a different way of thinking about this issue of congruence between my values and my work as a lawyer. I found myself drinking up the optimism, the people-centered focus of the model, and the ability to skip the ceremonial steps of battle and get right to a carefully designed discussion about solutions. I found myself drawn to what have now become two of my favorite questions to ask as a mediator. What's important to you about that, and how has this affected you? Questions that were not in my vocabulary as a litigator to that point. These questions I was drawn to not for their intrinsic therapeutic value, but as a pathway to resolution. So through my training as a mediator, which I began to see as healing my lawyer's soul, I realized that my mainstream experience as a litigator had created an internal conflict for me in two areas. One is the impact of the processes that I was continually engaged in on my clients, and the other was just found in the vision of the lawyer's role, the vision of my role. So I observed at that point that I was being asked to, in my work as a litigator, asked to move forward based on a couple of assumptions, and I concede these are simplified for the purpose of making the point that I want to make. One is that legal processes ought to protect substantive legal interests at the expense of the client's emotional and psychological life and of their relationships. And two, that the lawyer's role is to be a gladiator in the quest to protect those substantive legal interests with only passing regard for the client's emotional and psychological life and their relationships. So now that I became aware of this fundamental conflict in values, I realized that my need for authenticity, my need for congruence between my work and my values would only be met if I either reframed the process where I found myself engaged or reframed my vision for the lawyer's role and the lawyer's work. I ended up completing my training as a mediator, beginning to work in that field, and that actually did open up a whole new relationship between me and my work. that led to more satisfaction, if not with each file, at least with my place in the justice system. So to put it bluntly, no longer did I feel compelled to act impossibly as a rescuer in a system which often caused more harm than it did good for my clients. So shifts in court processes and the culture of lawyering over the last 10 years all move away from the reliance on adversarial, cumbersome adjudicative models. The trend towards diverse, more thoughtful dispute resolution approaches is clear, it's undeniable. It's part of the fundamental message of the Cromwell Report on Access to Justice. I've been involved in the growth of those processes over the years, but what's interested me the most is the shift in what's being asked of lawyers inside those settlement-oriented processes, and the way that lawyers respond to those at a personal level. That part to me is telling, and it forecasts, I think, some broader cultural shift in the lawyer's role. And let me give you a couple of quick examples. So Connie mentioned that I've been involved in the study of collaborative law as it's emerged, especially in the family law field. All studies of collaborative law show that lawyers who use this approach feel that it can serve their clients much better than a model which uses litigation to prompt, short adversarial bursts of negotiation. But as important as the benefit to the client, as important as the benefit to the client is the job satisfaction of the lawyers. Collaborative law lawyers universally say, I feel better about my work at the end of the day. And that's a clear drive behind the model. This kind of trend is less visible in the business sector, but you will also find it there. Professor Haven and I are working on a study on the use of settlement counsel in commercial litigation. What struck me about the interviews that we've done there is that the commercial litigators, veteran, hardened, you might say, commercial litigators, speak with the same refreshed enthusiasm about how great they felt about the resolution of those files, where they used that settlement model. Another example of the thirst for a deepened professional role and an expanded skill set is among judges. So over the last 2 years, I've been involved in a dozen training programs of judges across Canada in civil and criminal courts, all looking for a better way to engage with litigants, to experiment with processes that are problem-solving in nature, focused, or at least make room for some client interests, rather than just exclusively on legal positions. So judges, too, I find, are thirsty for a better and a more satisfying way of engaging in legal problems. So there's not much more I can say other than this. My message, I think, is a message of hope. As the system expands to offer more accessible, meaningful processes for clients, so will it expand to a more authentic role for lawyers. At least those lawyers who define authenticity the way I did. Processes to resolve legal disputes are being reframed. The lawyer's role is being reframed, I think, or expanded and opened up, and you see that in legal education. Connie mentioned that in our first-year curriculum, we have a program on dispute resolution and client-centered advocacy. I've taught in this program over the years, and every year I've been approached by students at its conclusion who say, I wasn't connecting to my legal education, I was feeling alienated, but now I think I might see a role for myself. That's authenticity. So as a mediator and a teacher of conflict resolution skills, I know I'm biased. I see this trend as an exciting time and an exciting opportunity for lawyers to connect differently to their work. And in the search for a process that might nurture clients' emotional well-being, we might just be able to nurture our own. But that was just my journey. Thank you.
Hello. I am a bit of a fish out of water here, and I'll give a context for that shortly. First of all, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me here today. I am not a lawyer, as Connie mentioned. I work in the area of counseling, social work, and psychotherapy. I'm approaching the subject of emotional well-being and legal practice from a somewhat different perspective. I'm going to say something about where I work and how I came to teach law students, and at times seasoned lawyers, on how to mitigate the effects of vicarious trauma. However, before I describe the Schleifer Clinic, I'll begin by addressing the topic itself. Vicarious trauma is hardly a new phenomenon, yet it is not widely known or understood outside the counseling professions. In 1990, Lisa McCann and Lori Ann Perlman published an article in which they first coined and defined the term and condition known as vicarious trauma to describe a new theoretical context for understanding this complex phenomenon, where helpers begin to display a constellation of symptoms comparable to their traumatized clients' set of symptoms. Prior to McCann and Perlman's article, a handful of research and subjective observations focused on therapist reactions to traumatized clients, but failed to understand gradual buildup of effect. In the years to follow, the literature and research in the field expanded to include other helping professions. In Transforming the Pain, a workbook on vicarious traumatization, Karen Sock-Whitney and Lori Ann Perlman listed criminal defense lawyers as being at risk. Since then, lawyers working in the areas of civil law, child protection, family law, refugee and immigration law have been identified as susceptible. There appears to be an emerging trend in the field of law which is starting to address the role of vicarious trauma. I'm going to give you a bare bones overview of an evolving module taught to law students at the start of their placement at the clinic that I work at. I argue for the necessity of teaching law students about the possible effects of encountering explicit and painful material while giving them the tools to help mitigate these sometimes inevitable effects. Such tools help support mental and physical health so that law students may skillfully work on behalf of their clients. The module content defines trauma and its symptomatology, details the impact on helpers who work with this population, and outlines strategies that help mitigate the effects of trauma. What follows proposes to expand the awareness of those who teach law students and questions whether it is sufficient that lawyers are trained to assume that the only things relevant to their relationship with their clients are how well they know the law and how well they can read and apply it. So let me say something about where I work, and you'll understand how I became a part of this. So, as was previously mentioned, I'm a director of counseling services at a nonprofit agency called the Barbara Schleifer Commemorative Clinic, which is a violence against women agency in the city of Toronto, Ontario, where counseling, legal representation, and interpreter services are provided to women experiencing a range of violence forms. The work consists of supporting women and girls 14 years of age and older. The population served includes women fleeing their country of origin as a consequence of gendered violence and lack of state protection, while women experience intersectional violence as a result of precarious status, poverty, discrimination, and systemic oppression. All our clients are traumatized. The legal department has 2 family law lawyers and 1 refugee immigration lawyer, in addition to 3 court support workers. The counseling department offers group and individual therapy, psychosocial assessments, expert reports, as well as public education, case management, housing, and advocacy. Our interpreter service department provides interpretation in over 90 languages, as well as American Sign Language and deaf interpretation. All staff are women. Volunteers and students are primarily women, all direct client work is done by women. We are situated in one of the most racially and ethnically diverse cities in Canada, where economic disparity between the haves and the have-nots is growing. Staff, students, and volunteers are reflective of the diverse communities the agency serves. The agency is unique in many aspects. There is a consistent working relationship among all three departments, where collaboration, support, and information are exchanged in an effort to serve clients while maintaining each of our distinct professional standards of privacy and confidentiality. Perhaps it is because of this unique configuration and our awareness of the impact of trauma, not only on our clients, but also on ourselves, that we identified a number of years ago the need for specialized training to our law students. Okay. So the purpose of training law students about vicarious trauma is fourfold. We want to help students develop skills to enable them to respond competently to the emotions, reactivity, and responses of traumatized clients. We also want to help students to cope with their own emotions, their own reactivity, and responses to clients' collective trauma symptoms, and to develop a vicarious trauma action plan, as well as to prepare students to be more effective lawyers when working with this population, as this work has the potential to be personally and professionally destabilizing. When I meet with new law students, I teach them how to identify the signs and symptoms consistent with trauma in order to better understand clients, right? Rather than personalize what's happening and have a reaction to that, right? What vicarious trauma is and what factors may increase the risk of vicarious trauma, along with how to take better care of oneself. In taking students through an overview of the possible psychological states of clients, my aim is to have them think about their own role in the traumatic continuum when talking about vicarious trauma. Consequently, definitions are crucial to clear thinking and skilled engagement. I find it useful, therefore, to delineate the nuances between terms like burnout, compassion fatigue, secondary trauma, countertransference, and vicarious trauma, as there is some confusion in the literature. Compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, and secondary trauma have been used interchangeably. Although some of these terms share common elements, each is subtly different. For example, burnout and countertransference happen across all professions, whereas vicarious trauma is specific to those of us who work with traumatized populations. Burnout and vicarious trauma may simultaneously be present, but each is unique. Mismanaged vicarious trauma can lead to burnout. Burnout is potentially avoidable. We can see it coming. While vicarious trauma, according to Perlman and Sock-Whitney, is inevitable and it will happen overnight. Countertransference responses may trigger vicarious trauma, and so on. What is distinct about vicarious trauma is that its cumulative effects transform helpers. Working with traumatized clients changes us. I inform students that if counselors work long enough with traumatized clients, at some point they will likely experience personal or professional crises. What John Briere, who is considered a trauma expert in my field, refers to as an existential confrontation, where we recognize how easily our own health and well-being are negatively affected. I explain to students that once we cross this threshold, we will never be the same, nor can we go back to the worldview we once held or to the person we were before we took the step to work with survivors of trauma. We are transformed because we care about other people who've been hurt, and we are committed to helping them. The idea here is that our empathy is our strength, but it is also our Achilles heel. We see, hear, and sometimes experience for ourselves firsthand the worst aspects of humankind and cannot ever unknow what we have learned. Assumptions are forever ruptured about who we are, about our personal safety in the world, and even more so about the decency, kindness, honesty, and integrity of humankind. However, helpers who are themselves survivors of trauma have always known these realities to be evident. Students learn that not only does vicarious trauma change our identity and worldview, but changes to our spirituality, what are known as our self-capacities, our ego resources, and our very sensory system, our nervous system. Those changes as well are possible. We may distance ourselves from others or have sadistic and or retaliatory thoughts about those people who have hurt our clients. We may We may shift from hope to hopelessness. We might have difficulty trusting others. We may experience self-criticism, anxiety, depression, loneliness, even sorrow, anger, and rage. Our capacity to self-soothe might be compromised, and/or we could engage in addictive behaviors. Our ability to be introspective might lessen, and we may lose our ability to be empathic. Other examples of weakened ego resources include difficulty maintaining boundaries. And this often generates a very lengthy discussion about those situations where somehow we encounter a client that is somehow different from all the rest and all the usual rules don't apply, and then we start having fuzzy boundaries with that client, right? Very common in the area in which I work. Other examples of weakened ego resources include, I just said that, difficulty maintaining boundaries, cloudy cognitive processing, poor decision-making skills, difficulty taking care of self, and lack of interest in others. Trauma impels us into an emergency state where biological systems associated with survival are primed. So it literally can get under our skin. And in my area that I work in, study along the lines of the brain and the nervous system shows that, in fact, it does deeply affect different parts of our brain, where certain parts of our brain will go offline and other parts of our brain will become activated, and our nervous system will start to be engaged in very different ways. So, our nervous system is activated so that we might experience intrusive recall of a client's trauma imagery into our own awareness, and this is common. We may even have nightmares in which a client's critical incident is reenacted, and we are either a helpless bystander or we are the client herself. These dreams can be quite distressing, often requiring immediate support. We could experience the bodily sensations that a client experiences, such as physical pain. However, at this point, when I'm teaching law students, it can start to feel quite heavy, right? But what I want to reassure them is knowledge is power. So if you have this information in advance of practicing, then you're not going to have this come at you and not know what the heck is happening, right? So the intention, of course, is not to alarm them, but to give them the information they will need so they can approach their reactions to the work without harsh self-judgment, and instead with understanding, in order to access the supports and strategies necessary to help them navigate their way. I state that vicarious trauma is common amongst those of us who work with traumatized individuals, and according to some clinicians, it is inevitable. It does not mean there is something inherently wrong with us. Human beings tend to respond in these ways to a perceived threat in their environment in an attempt to cope, whether we directly experience or witness trauma ourselves or hear about these events after the fact. Research in the area of neuroscience and neuropsychology are beginning to understand and uncover ways in which the human brain and nervous system respond to and cope with the impact of trauma in the aftermath of danger in fairly common, consistent, and patterned behaviors. I reassure students that they are being given the tools to mediate these effects. The topic then shifts to risk factors that increase our tendency to develop vicarious trauma. And the intention in doing this, again, is to give law students permission to take care of themselves and to help them understand that caring for themselves is ethical. Not only will self-care support their optimum personal health, it will in turn improve and sustain their professional competency. Taking care of oneself requires intention, a plan, commitment, and implementation. Here we go. Okay. The building blocks to any vicarious trauma action plan includes awareness, balance, and connection, known as the ABCs. I think I need to go back. There we go. The first step is that we begin to become self-aware. And this requires intention, and it requires practice. It requires time and reflection. And I recommend to students that they think about regularly making time in their schedule to ask themselves what signs or symptoms of vicarious trauma they experienced in the last while, if any. Balance means equalizing your work, rest, and play while prioritizing your personal life. So conversations evolve around, what are your priorities? You know, all of us need this to help us in the work that we do if we're working with this population. Having fun and forgetting about work may seem simple, even trite, but the reality is that fun is not necessarily effortless for helpers who work consistently with traumatized individuals. Our refugee immigration lawyer must surely work over 60 hours a week and on weekends. And our family law lawyers always get that document delivered at the end of day on Friday. Right? Just to screw them over, right? I see that happen, right? It's like, oh, I had a weekend plan. No, weekend's gone, right? So ensuring we experience joy and playfulness renews a sense of pleasure and wonder that is easily extinguished when faced with repetitive accounts of violence and suffering, in addition to the natural inevitable costs of working with highly dissociative clients. I follow with a discussion about connection. Connection is crucial, and explain that connection is critical to ourselves, so feeling connected to ourselves, others, or even something bigger than us. I inform students that being connected to themselves gives them important information about who they are and what they need, and if they know this, then they know when to seek help. Maintaining a connection to others as well as to ourselves is a bulwark against the pernicious effects of vicarious trauma. I give an example about a past presentation in which I spoke with family law lawyers about vicarious trauma. The lawyers identified isolation as a central feature of their work that left them grappling with what I observed were signs of vicarious trauma in the room. They recognized that working alone endangered their well-being. At the end of the workshop, the group decided to explore the possibility of meeting together regularly so they might support one another. They knew that they could offer one another validation and hope in the midst of despair, in addition to opportunities to debrief and share coping strategies. If the law does not support a culture of acceptance, then I suggest to law students they take active steps to support themselves and each other, now and in the future, whether that looks like peer supervision and or individual supervision. Connection, however, does not end here. It extends to something larger than us. When I ask students to reflect on what gives their life meaning, I observe a kind of stillness descends on the group while they consider the import of this question for themselves. Other aspects of a vicarious trauma plan include working, let me see here, sorry. Am I going backwards or frontwards? Oh, there we go. Other aspects of a vicarious trauma action plan include working protectively and developing the capacity to transform vicarious trauma. And working protectively might look like the following: setting limits with clients. So this was another discussion that happened when I went to do a training with family law lawyers out in Oshawa, and a number of them said, you know, I knew that I had to do the law in a different way when I was starting to drive my client to all of her appointments. Because the client is traumatized, and she's in a situation where her life is in danger. And we can't rescue everyone, right? Or anyone, really. And this is the same for counselors, right? So when I see my counselors do that, we need to have a conversation about that. So this is where you want to expand the resources and the supports that are available for your clients, right? You don't want to take that on. And you also want to develop healthy working habits, right? So often, we do not know what sustains us, as we tend to function day to day in a mode of automaticity rather than attentive awareness. This is particularly true in trauma work because there's always a crisis. Our whole system speeds up, and I notice that myself. And when we speed up and we don't slow ourselves down, then we don't necessarily respond as skillfully as we can. Taking care of yourself at work might also encompass having access to consistent supervision and consultation, in addition to scheduling client load and client distribution in an effort to avoid overwhelm. I just did a training at Parkdale Community Legal Services for their students, which is another legal clinic in Toronto, and I talked about if you have, say for example, 2 very challenging clients, or you experience them as challenging, let's frame it that way, think about not booking them back to back, if you can, right? Just thinking in that way, you know? And then I said, because sometimes we can begin to feel that dread in our chest as we approach that hour, and they all start nodding their heads. Oh my God, I don't have to feel dread, right? No, we don't have to feel dread. Let's take care of ourselves. Also, balancing a variety of tasks rather than repeatedly doing one task that is depleting will help to lessen the risk as well. So the research is showing that we really need to mix up what it is that we do and nourish ourselves. Other strategies include having an appropriate workspace. This is so true in nonprofits. How many of us really have that kind of workspace? An environment where there is collegial respect. This is the most important thing. And access to mental health benefits, as well as vacation time, sick days, and dependent days. So if your child is sick, you get to stay home and you get paid for it. Another way of working protectively includes planning your schedule in advance as much as possible so that you are not left scrambling just before deadlines, if that's possible. We know that's not always possible. All of the above might seem obvious, but I have discovered that in the field of trauma, we tend to forego breaks, lunches, connection to others, seeking out supervision, making time for leisure, and planning well in advance when caught up in constant crisis. Although we may intellectually know what we need to do, unless we make a concerted effort to change how we work, we will remain vulnerable. Changing how we do our work is critical. Okay. So I end the training by addressing the ways in which we might transform vicarious trauma. Not only transform it, but we're looking at vicarious post-traumatic growth. Right? This is a good thing. Let's say that. To do this, we must discover and then nurture meaning and hope despite all we have come to know, recognizing what gives our life and our work meaning, what instills and renews hope, even when the work is severely demanding, will create compassion, steadiness, and equilibrium. And that's what we want. The very act that we are acting for the good of others who are scared and hurt speaks to the best in humanity and ourselves. And we have to remind ourselves of that. Working with traumatized individuals obliges us to know ourselves more deeply and with greater understanding. Self-reflectiveness increases legal competence. Knowing ourselves in this way is a powerful antidote to vicarious trauma, along with the strategies and tools previously discussed. So I've just given you a brief sort of snapshot of what happens, but I've not gone into detail about what are some of the ways that students can actually help themselves in those moments when they're experiencing reactivity. And what does reactivity look like? They might go from 0 to 100 in a nanosecond and be very angry with a client, right? That's reactivity, right? So how do you manage that? How do you remain present, and how do you continue to work with the client when that happens? And so I look at some concrete resources which are called somatic resourcing, so that they actually have concrete tools. And also in my profession, what we've discovered is that we cannot talk our way out of trauma. So, Freud, you sit down and you tell your story over and over again, and eventually the idea was that was supposed to extinguish the impact that had on you. The impact meaning the kind of physical sensations that were in your body that caused you suffering. We have discovered that, in fact, what this does is the opposite. Somebody's nodding her head, she knows. We have to work very differently now with trauma clients. We have to get out of the head, and we have to get into the body, and we have to do what's called body work. There's all sorts of different kinds of body work, but the one that's really predominant right now in my profession is mindfulness. And I use some mindfulness strategies with students, some simple tools that they can use in their day-to-day practice. At the end of the training, students should be able to define vicarious trauma, recognize its signs. Did I say that? Put that up there. Okay. At the end of the training, students should be able to define vicarious trauma, recognize its signs, and learn ways to minimize its impact. They should also take away some concrete strategies to take better care of themselves. They should have a newfound, if not already present, sense of the merit in exploring their own reactions to hearing about traumatic events. And if they have a trauma history, then they should understand the need to explore their personal unresolved traumatic experiences that might make them more vulnerable to vicarious trauma. However, there is a reverse of that too. Survivors of trauma can actually be more resilient. So we can't make assumptions. It is necessary to instill hope without being glib or without minimizing the impact of trauma. I do find when I do this training that there's a lot of energy after the training, and it's like students are pumped. I can't put my finger on it, but they say we've come to the right place. But what I find with students is that they often bring high ideals, energy, and a fresh perspective that seasoned and sometimes world-weary practitioners, maybe like myself, have lost. They may challenge beliefs of practiced lawyers and may even experience a deep satisfaction that comes through learning and working within an area of law that provides access to justice for people who may otherwise have none. The students that come to our agency are not naive. That's not my experience of them. They articulate, in the midst of admiration for the law, knowledge of its limitations, particularly for those who are marginalized. Despite these limitations, they are committed to using the law to represent those most disadvantaged in society. I believe that such drive speaks to their determination and their resiliency, and this is what I call upon when I do this training. It is their strength I acknowledge when training them on what can present as fairly overwhelming subject matter. Equipping law students with the tools, supports, and interventions to mitigate, manage, and transform vicarious trauma will help to maintain their physical and mental health, in addition to maintaining and improving their competency when delivering service to clients, and ultimately, I believe, enhance their longevity in the profession. Thank you.
Okay, good morning. Might want some time to shake your sillies out after all this conversation. I teach a class at the University of Saskatchewan College of Law called Law and Happiness. I've been asked on many occasions if it's an oxymoron, so save that comment for later. And I need to start with a disclaimer that not all lawyers are happy. There is an interesting reaction to the title of my class, and a friend of mine who's here has taken to sign his emails to me as from X in unbridled joy, and I hadn't thought of calling it Law and Unbridled Joy, but I'll think about that. There are some mums who stay in the profession quite happily, thank you very much. There are some women who love their life as lawyers and get up and go to work happily and have balanced, great lives. And there are some men who are doing some paternal duty on their off hours and on hours. So I want to just acknowledge all of those things. There are some happy lawyers. There are also some unhappy lawyers. We should put a schedule together so we could sort of trade jobs on occasion and make sure everybody's getting a little bit of everything, but we're not there yet. How does a lawyer that's got a background in constitutional law end up in happiness in the law? Well, it kind of made sense to me, you know, what's your constitution? What is your personal constitution? And it sort of led there naturally. I want to back up a little bit and talk about why we're even here having a conference called The Power in Law. The idea for this conference was inspired by a discussion among women faculty here and Justice Georgina Jackson. And she came to us as she was preparing to speak at a Women's Day conference breakfast and talk about the power in law. And so we met in the faculty lounge and we dumped our backpacks on the table and we emptied our purses and we looked in our pockets, and everyone was searching for the power that they had as lawyers in the profession. And we weren't coming up with much in terms of what that power tool was that we had. And so we started looking around. Okay, who's the first woman that went to law school here? And we came up with Elsie Hall, which was interesting. Elsie Hall is the first woman that was a law student here. And so we look around a little bit more. Who's the first sort of minority? There's a Japanese student in the picture in the 40s. Like, how hard would it have been to be a Japanese student in the College of Law in the 40s when good things weren't happening for Japanese people here in Canada? That was amazing. So then another day, a colleague and I walked through and looked for Aboriginal lawyers in the photos. Like, was their power developing? How long before there were enough women in the college? And so, okay, what is this power? What does it look like? Do the judges have it, if that's the pinnacle? Is that where you go to look to see, do women judges have the power? Is that where it is? What is that power anyway? We didn't find it. We didn't know where to look for it. We didn't know actually what we were looking for. Haven't said that yet. So in the search for this holy grail, this conference crystallized, okay? We wanted to talk about what that power looks like. And we decided that the workshop way of doing conferences would be the best because we wanted to have conversations with each other about what our lives look like. And we've got all the stats and the data, and the people in the room who are living some of those stats and data don't need to read stats and data to know that that's what their lives look like. So how can we do this? We'll give you a bunch of presentations, and then we'll go off on our own. In my personal, well, I guess in sort of just the stats that you've been hearing here, you know that the legal profession is suffering from a very bad reputation these days, particularly in the United States with a lack of employment for lawyers. I read something on my cell phone this morning that said in the United States there is something like a 300,000 drop in applications of students into law schools in the United States, from $600 and some thousand students down to 300 and some thousand. That's pretty significant for the American law student population. Reduction of numbers applying to get into law school, repercussion from the recession, we've heard over and over, it's the recession, return on investment, it's expensive to get a law degree, and so now you need to go and get a high-paying, highfalutin job to pay off the debt that you have, reduced opportunities in articles, and the downsizing of firms. The big buck theory, I like to think of it as. the big buck bang isn't as loud as it used to be, and so students and lawyers are starting to look around to see what's going on with it. I have opinions about all of those things, but what I really want to talk about today is not about, are there enough women there? Do we make enough? Are there enough opportunities? I want to talk about the people who are there and what they're doing. I want to talk about why you choose to go to law school in the first place. And there's lots of reasons for doing it, and we could go around the room, and I'll try to predict what some of those are, because some of them actually are related to the big buck theory. Take up the practice of law for lots of reasons: promise of money, ability to move up the class ladder, ability to participate in the political venue. Some people want to change the world, or at least their world. Some people are actually inspired, just like Anne Murray was. If Elvis Presley can sing, so can I. They find their lawyer, they're in the middle of their legal dispute, and say, if my lawyer can be a lawyer, so can I. And so we've got lots of people coming to law schools for lots of reasons. Some students, and I go to our first day with our first year law students, and I say, what are you doing here? Why law school? And they say, well, I had an arts degree, or I had a science degree, and my option was go to law school and get a professional degree with the likely outcome of having a pretty good income, or go and do a master's and then a PhD, and then hopefully get a job doing something someplace else. And so law school seemed like a good option. Some students, you may or may not be surprised to know, are actually told by mom and dad still, sort of at 22 or 5 years of age, that you are going to law school, and that's what you're doing. And you must go to law school. There's a tradition of law school, and you're going to law school. So there are lots and lots of reasons. Never in all of my years have I ever heard somebody say, I want to think like a lawyer, which is what we say we do at law school, right? What do you do in law school? We're not here to train practitioners. This is not a skills-based center. We aren't dealing with practitioner skills here. We are an academic institution, and we are going to train you how to think like a lawyer. That's language they get when they're here. I originally became interested in why people choose law because I was looking at the health of people within the law, and this is going to touch on some of the things that have been mentioned already. One of the machinations of I felt so normalized when I found out that many people have up to 5 to 7 jobs. I started to think it looked like I can't hold a job, but I'm actually looking quite normal based on the stats I heard this morning. One of the jobs I did have was I was a director of research for the First Nations and Métis Justice Reform Commission when the Starlight Tours were going on in Saskatoon. And I had the opportunity to work with a woman who worked with vicarious trauma, cumulative stress, post-traumatic stress with firefighters and EMT, or first responders. And I knew her through my son's high school, and the more we talked, the more I started thinking about provincial court judges. Every day, every single case they hear is about a crisis. And so how could this not be impacting on them? And then I started thinking about police officers, and for those of you who are CBC advocates, you'll have heard this week the stats on the RCMP and post-traumatic stress disorder are quite high. And so it's not a big leap to see that firemen and ambulance drivers and police officers who are seeing crisis daily and repeatedly, and often with the same people, are suffering from things like post-traumatic stress disorder. Since the time that the Justice Reform Commission was working in 2003, I've had a chance to think about this in terms of all kinds of legal experiences, in terms of family law. You know, I remember making a very concrete deal with the devil when I graduated that I would not practice family law, that I will do anything you ask, but don't make me practice family law, because I would need to build the biggest house in Saskatoon to take all those kids home with me, because I couldn't deal with that every day. And so what was it like to be a family lawyer? What's it like to be a family court judge? What's it like to be a corporate lawyer? That seems like a nice, clean, sterilized environment. Okay, let's talk about mergers and acquisitions. Let's talk about taking over. Let's talk about multi-million-dollar deals that come across your desk and don't screw this up, and how difficult that would be. And I started to think, this stuff could be happening to pretty much everybody. I started looking at the legal system in a much different way, and I started looking at rates of depression. When I started at the College of Law, of course, there's an immense amount of pressure to write here, as you can imagine. And I started Googling, what would I like to write about? So I started Googling law and happiness. That's what I would like to write about. And I came across things like cutting-edge law and humanizing law and emotions in the legal profession, emotional law, justice as healing. I started sort of finding all of those were the hits that I was getting. And then I found Professor Krieger's work and Professor Daykoff's work. And I started to read about the health of our profession now. Some of you might know all this information already, and Professor Krieger kind of alluded to it this morning, but I just want to talk about the things that I was finding. And I started to think about, okay, if there's so many stats about depression of law students and lawyers, and this starts very early on. So the statistics, and they're dated back into the 90s, but the statistics go something like a normal segment of society has a rate of major depressive disorder at something like 9%. And when we bring law students into law school, they are at about the same rate. By Christmas time, it doesn't look so pretty. It's 30%. By the end of first year, it's 40%. And it stays that way straight through into the profession. That's really high. And they studied 104 professions and found lawyers suffering at that rate higher than any other of the 104. Next to, of course, and I know someone wants to shout out dentistry, you're wrong. Kindergarten teachers. Thank God my son's in grade 4 now. I didn't know this at the time. And secretaries. And all of you who have secretaries are going, oh yeah, I know about that. Contributed to that. I know that. So that's interesting. Don't you think that's interesting that we don't talk about that? So my presentation is something that I'm a little bit nervous about. It's like talking about jock itch. Nobody does it, okay? We don't do that in our firms. We don't talk about yeast infections. And so when you start talking about emotional issues with lawyers, everybody gets a little bit uncomfortable. And when we talk about why women are leaving or why people are having trouble within the profession, we don't want to talk about these things. We want to clinicalize everything we say. Our training as lawyers is to design institutional language around the things that we're looking at, okay? As I carried on my research, I started running into articles in the Lawyers Weekly on services like Lawyers Concern for Lawyers, which most of you from Saskatchewan will be familiar with, and there's all kinds of machinations of that, and post-traumatic stress disorder. So what happens to lawyers who have this high propensity to depression? Well, that's been mentioned already. You can do things like become addicted to all kinds of things, not just your work. And that's a whole other conference, addiction to your work and alcoholism and workaholism. But alcoholism, drug abuse, divorce rates start to go up, gambling, all kinds of things start to go up. And so I'm starting to read all this stuff and I think, okay, I've been reading about positive psychology, and I have the most impressive collection of self-help books, let me tell you. And all of this stuff started coming together for me, and I was like, okay, what is going on with our profession if we've got so many people that aren't happy with what they're doing, and where is that showing up? So I started talking to some of my friends about this, and I have friends who have come and gone from the profession. I have friends who have suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder within their profession, friends who have got alcohol problems, friends who have tried suicide within the profession, all of the things that we don't talk about. And And these are all fantastic, wonderful people. And so are they telling each other about it? Who are they telling about it? I had Lawyers Concern for Lawyers come and talk to my class, and the thing that they were left with for sure was, it's very confidential. We don't even talk to them later to see if the service worked. It's that confidential, okay? So we don't know how well our services are being provided for our lawyers. I read news articles and started to hear from law students and lawyers about the stress of law. I read articles on women leaving the workforce, men being sidetracked due to family engagement, articles on men who simply wanted to have a life through community, sports, and so on. I turned TED Talk into a lifestyle. I'm a junkie. I watched YouTube videos late into the night. Law articles on everything from the role of emotions in negotiations, happy ethical lawyers in unethical jobs, to the effect of Bhutan on the United Nations and how we're measuring gross national happiness instead of gross national product. There's an epidemic of happiness out there, and I was out of the loop, and so I wanted to jump back into that. I discovered a lot of material on what to do with depression, theories on what makes people happy, and the lists you've actually been exposed to some of the lists already. Professor Krieger talked about some of them. He talked about autonomy, authenticity, relatedness, connectedness. You've also heard about self-awareness, balance, and connection. You will hear about all of the things that you need to have balance in your life, okay? Why are lawyers unhappy? What makes lawyers unhappy? Well, there's the father of positive psychology, Martin Seligman, who says among practitioners responding to a poll, 52% describe themselves as dissatisfied, are retiring early, leaving the profession altogether. Financial recognition may be a symptom of the problem. Recent pay increases at law firms are themselves partially caused by lawyer dissatisfaction. The euphemistic retention bonuses are awarded to ensure young associates extend their service beyond 2 or 3 years. Combating this desire to leave early among law firms is the highest priority, since they can only recoup their investment in new lawyers. In addition to being disenchanted, lawyers are in remarkably poor health. They are at a much greater risk than the general population for depression, heart disease, alcoholism, and use of illegal drugs. And then he goes into the study that I have already mentioned to you. Unhappy lawyers not only burden their families, given their role in the public profession, they also injure their clients by failing to provide adequate representation. Unhappiness and depression are intimately associated with passivity, poor productivity. Bar associations have the best data on these costs, since lawyers who violate clients' interests often become disciplinary problems. And you can log into your local law society website and see the history of case law and what happens. And one of the things that I've been reading about is that's where the signs start to show up. You're mismanaging trust funds, you're not showing up at work, clients are complaining about calls that aren't being returned. It doesn't take too much thinking to see why would it be that lawyers aren't, that this is impacting on a lawyer's family, okay? What you do for a living, how is this impacting on your family? Well, if you think about the qualities of a very good lawyer, very good lawyers know how to take either side of a case. Very good lawyers know how to poke holes in the other person's case, how to really pull that little thread out to see if the entire fabric unravels or what the argument actually is. Very good lawyers spend a lot of crazy hours at the office. And they can suffer from vicarious liability or emotional contagion from their clients. That wouldn't make you fun for a partner. You get home at the end of the day and you want to know the facts of the day. You pick holes in, what do you mean you didn't get this, you didn't do that, okay? So all of the skills you need to be a good lawyer are not necessarily, and probably not likely, the same skills you need to be a good partner when you get home at the end of the day. I actually have some friends who, in the middle of an argument, if the kids have a need, will say, okay, we're going to agree to adjourn this sine die. and move along, okay? And so there's some skills that you can take back and forth, but how far can we go with this? What do you do when our professional ethics, which we spend a lot of time talking about, which has been now mandated to professional responsibility, something we want in all the law schools across the country, what do you do when your professional ethics and your personal ethics and morals come to a crossroad? We don't talk about those kinds of things. We take professional responsibility, but we don't raise the issue about personal ethics. We live it. They're not good bedfellows, but we live with, okay, that doesn't make me feel good. I don't want to take this case on. What if you're the judge that is sitting and listening to the cases? What if you're a judge that's actually been sexually traumatized and being exposed to sexually traumatized clients in the courtroom on a regular basis? What if you grew up in an alcoholic family and the clients that are appearing in front of you are suffering from alcoholism? We don't talk about what that looks like or what we should do about it. What if the crime that the client has committed that you have to deal with is something that's personally incredibly offensive to you? So I was worried about all of these things, and am I contributing as a professor to our students' lifestyle? When you start with the pub crawl lifestyle here at the university and it continues into the profession, am I contributing to that? When I went to go to school in Boston, there was a class offered there called Law and Happiness, and I tried so hard to get into that class, and the waiting list was as long as Santa's list, and I couldn't get in. And so I've made up what I thought law and happiness should or could or might be. I designed a course on my own. I have students that showed up. There was a waiting list for my class, I'll have to add quickly. There was a waiting list to get into my class, but my students will all tell you if they're, I don't think I have any in the room here, but they will all tell you they are bullied on a pretty regular basis, not just by their colleagues here about what the hell are you doing taking Law and Happiness, and is that going to show up on your transcript? And but their parents who are in the legal profession are saying, don't take that class. You do not need that class. And so they're there anyway, and my hat's off to my students who are taking this class. And what are we doing once they're in there is we talked about the stats about depression. We talked about what students are facing. They talked about their lives in sort of selecting the classes, selecting their lifestyle. They're all on that I need an article treadmill. They're all reading the American data that says there is no articling job for you. And so what they had to do is they all had to choose a book to read and present to the class, and I didn't care what the book was on, as long as it connected sort of well-being of a lawyer or a law student to some health issue. And so some of them found the science of it. What actually happens to your brain, and what are the hormones being released, and what happens to the neocortex when this and this and this happens. And so they have the scientific language of what happens when you get depressed and when you don't like your job and when you feel that there are no options for you. And some of them, I have quite a few women in the class. I think I have 3 or 4 men, and the rest are women. And a lot of the women are saying, I want a life when I get into the firm. I want to be able to have families, but I want to have I want to be a partner. I've interviewed women. I talked to the women in the firm I'm going to article in, and they're not saying it's going to be very good, but I want it to be really good. So they're writing about women's experiences in law firms. I've encouraged them to go into communities and talk to the women and talk to the men available to them, because one of the things we're learning in the happiness research is the only way to know if you're going to be happy in a career you select is not to decide for yourself, is not to watch I don't watch TV, so I'd like so date myself. LA Law, whatever. Nobody even know. None of my students at LA Law. What is that? Is to watch television and see what lawyers' lives look like. To see mom and dad coming home at the end of the day. Do you talk to them about the fact that what are the cases they're working on? What do their lives look like when they're in the office every day? The only way to know if you're going to like whatever career you choose is to actually go and talk to the lawyer that's doing the work that you want to do. So they've all taken on their books and they've come to class, and we've been studying what happens to women in the class. We've been studying what happens to men who take the family lifestyle. We've been talking about pro bono work, because one of the things that was touched on by Professor Krieger is that sort of moving from your internal to your external world and giving back to community and what that looks like. And so the head of the pro bono is in my class here, and she's studying how to get more lawyers to do more pro bono work, and she's come up with fascinating information about what motivates people to give, in particular lawyers. So we are having more fun than we probably should have in Law and Happiness. We are we are learning about a lot of things that are blowing the students away in terms of how come we didn't know that this was there was all these sort of depression things that were going on. I said, for the same reason you don't know what a billable hour is. It's just not time to know that yet. It's not going to come up for a while. But I think they're ready for when it does. I think they're happy to be in the classroom. I don't know if this class will continue. I know that the students are really enjoying it. I don't know what impact it'll have on them as they move into the future. I really am trying to sort of implement some longitudinal studies to talk to students who are in the same class as them, who didn't take the class, as well as them, to follow them into their careers to see if it makes a difference. Asking the questions before you get into the firm about what your life looks like. They have taken meditation up, because one of the practices about mindfulness, and there's law schools that have mindful practices all over the United States at this point, what that means. And so I'm happy to talk about the practices the students have taken up. Thank you very much.
All right, so now we're running much more overtime than we had originally thought. I did, however, do we still have Lawrence Krieger on Skype? So does anyone perhaps have any questions and I'm going to particularly say of certainly Lawrence Krieger, because we have kept him online, and I know that probably the discussion that we have had today has invited much self-reflection, perhaps a lot of questions and comments that people want to make. There's going to be room for that kind of discussion in the panel lunches that we are now sort of running behind on, but I will open the floor right now for questions or comments, particularly for Mr. Krieger. Yes. Oh, if I could just, I need to make sure you get a microphone so that he can hear you. Thank you.
Thanks. So this question is for Professor Krieger, but I suppose also for anybody. And I was just curious in hearing you talk about coherence and in some ways thriving in the legal profession. I'm curious about how that varies with different personal and psychological makeup. And to take something like the Big Five personality trait, so I was wondering whether, to the extent that, and some of Marty Seligman's stuff mentions that the people who tend to go into law tend to like arguing. You know, there may be some differences there, and so somebody who scores high on, say, an agreeability level, is relatedness more important to them? How does the interpersonal variation in terms of who we are, how we come to this, how does that affect these kind of common need for coherence? Does that question sound coherent? Can you hear my question?
Yes.
Yes, there's just a long delay with the web connection, so people just have to be patient. I guess we're far away. Yes, there's just a long delay with the web connection. People just have to be patient. So honestly, I haven't done that work. Others have, but from what we can tell from our research, these needs for relatedness to others, which is interpersonal coherence, and autonomy, interpersonal coherence, really are universal needs. It doesn't vary by personal type. And I've even had students come out of class after I've given this kind of talk to them and say, and typically they're students that I know aren't doing well psychologically, and they'll ask me, so what if, I understand what you're saying, but what if you really don't care about people and you don't have friends and you don't socialize? And my answer is, well, the consequences are what you see there in that data, and so this is why we do the education on this. People can make choices about how they spend their time and energy, and these are the things quite universally that make people happy. It's not to say that there wouldn't be differences between introverts and extroverts and so forth, but I think those differences are going to be minimal compared to the reality of everything else. I'll also say in this new research that we have with the 6,000 plus data sets from lawyers, we've actually analyzed different groups, like the public service group with the government lawyers and public defenders and prosecutors and legal services people, public service-oriented people, and compared them to the highest paid, large firm, highly sophisticated lawyer groups, and everything operates pretty much identically in the two different groups. So I think these universal needs and motivational realities are a lot stronger than those individual differences.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? We have time perhaps for one more question for Professor Krieger. No? All right, well, thank you, everyone. And if anybody could join me in a round of applause for our spectacular panelists.